There's a 75,000-year-old object sitting in a museum that shouldn't exist. It's not a weapon. It's not a tool. It's not food. Nobody needed it to survive. And the only honest explanation anyone has ever found for why it was made is this. Someone, a very long time ago, was simply bored. Here's why that single fact should bother you more than it sounds like it should. For most of human history, survival was supposed to be the only thing that mattered. Hunt, gather, build shelter, avoid predators. Repeat, there wasn't supposed to be room left over for anything else, and for a long time, that's exactly what researchers assumed. Every waking hour of early human life was presumed to be consumed by the business of not dying. No downtime, no idle hands, no boredom. Because boredom requires spare time. And spare time was supposed to be a luxury nobody in the Stone Age could afford. That assumption turned out to be badly wrong, and the correction reshapes almost everything that follows. Anthropologist Richard Lee spent the early to mid-1960s living among the Ju-Hwansi of the Kalahari Desert, one of the last populations on Earth. Still living something close to a hunter-gatherer existence, and found that they spent something in the range of 15 to 20 hours a week on direct subsistence work, not per day, per week. The rest of the time, they rested, talked, and did essentially nothing in particular. When Lee presented this data at a landmark 1966 anthropology symposium, fellow anthropologist Marshall Solins seized on it and coined a phrase that stuck. The original affluent society, not because these groups had possessions, but because they had something modern life quietly stripped away, time with nothing scheduled in it. So the real question was never whether ancient humans got bored. It's what they actually did about it. And the answer, once you start tracing it, connects almost every distinctly human thing you've ever done. Start with the obvious one: they made things nobody needed. In the early 2000s, archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood and his team, excavating a site in South Africa called Blombos Cave, uncovered a small collection of Necerius crocianus shells, sea snail shells, deliberately perforated, coated in traces of red ochre, and dated to roughly 75,000 years old. These weren't tools. They showed no signs of ever having cut, scraped, or dug anything. The wear patterns matched exactly what you'd expect from being strung on a cord and worn against skin. They were beads, jewelry, the oldest known personal ornaments in the archaeological record. Think about what that actually required. Drilling a clean hole through a small, curved shell using a stone point with no metal, no electricity, and nothing resembling a modern tool is slow, fiddly, frustrating work closer to an entire afternoon than a quick task. Someone sat down with that shell, and instead of doing something useful, spent hours making themselves something to wear. Necessity doesn't explain that. Boredom does. You don't need a decorated shell to survive the next winter. You need one when the alternative is staring at the wall of a cave with absolutely nothing else to occupy your hands or your mind. The beads weren't a one-off, either. In an even older layer of the same cave, dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, Henshelwood's team found something stranger: a complete toolkit for mixing paint. 2 abalone shells had been used as mixing containers, along with grinding stones, animal bone, and charcoal, all combined to produce a liquid ochre pigment, essentially the world's oldest known art studio, 100,000 years before anyone would call it that. There's no evidence this pigment was used for anything practical like tanning hide or treating a wound. The best explanation anyone has is the same one that explains the beads: someone had time, materials, and nothing urgent to do with either. The same pattern shows up again, tens of thousands of years later, in an entirely different medium. In 2008, a team led by archaeologist Nicholas Conard, excavating Hohle Fels Cave in southern Germany, recovered 12 fragments of carved bone that fit together into a flute made from the wing bone of a griffon vulture, with 5 carefully spaced finger holes, dated to somewhere around 40,000 years old. Someone roughly 40,000 years before agriculture, before cities, before anything resembling the civilization you'd recognize, sat down with a hollow bird bone and worked out how to turn it into a musical instrument. Not because a flute solved any survival problem, because they had time on their hands and a bird bone within reach, and their brain apparently found that combination irresistible. There's a real scientific debate over exactly how deep music runs in the human brain. Neuroscientist Daniel Levitin, who has spent much of his career studying the biology of music, has argued that our capacity for rhythm and melody may predate full spoken language, that the same pattern recognition machinery that helped early humans track seasons, animal movements, and danger also happens to be the machinery that makes music feel meaningful to us. That claim is genuinely contested among researchers, and it isn't settled the way some retellings suggest. What is far less contested is simpler and almost as strange. Give a human brain enough unstructured time and nothing to process, and it will often start generating rhythm and pattern on its own, unprompted, for no practical reason at all. But boredom didn't just produce objects and sound. It produced something considerably stranger, the ability to imagine things that aren't there. Consider what boredom actually requires as an experience. You cannot be bored without some working sense of time, without a felt difference between now and later, and some internal comparison suggesting that later could be better than this. A dog waiting by the door for its owner isn't bored in that sense. It's just waiting, with no model of alternate futures running in the background. But a human sitting by a fire, everything already done for the day, nothing left to occupy their attention, starts running exactly that kind of simulation. What if tomorrow's hunt goes badly? What's actually making that sound in the dark past the firelight? What's on the far side of that ridge nobody has ever crossed? Where do people go when they stop being alive? Every question that would eventually become religion, philosophy, and science appears to have started the same unglamorous way somebody's mind, with nothing else to do, started wandering into places it didn't strictly need to go. There's real experimental evidence that boredom doesn't just permit this kind of wandering, it actively produces useful output from it. In 2013, psychologist Sandi Mann and her colleague Rebecca Cadman at the University of Central Lancashire ran a deliberately unglamorous experiment. They had one group of participants copy numbers out of a phone book for 15 straight minutes, about as tedious a task as they could construct, while a comparison group skipped that step entirely. Afterward, both groups were asked to come up with as many different uses as they could think of for a plastic cup, a standard creativity measure. The group that had just endured 15 minutes of mind-numbing copying performed measurably better on the creativity task than the group that hadn't. Mann's explanation was that boredom pushes people toward daydreaming. And daydreaming is where a meaningful share of creative connection-making actually happens. Boredom, in other words, isn't creativity's enemy. In controlled conditions, it's one of the more reliable ways to trigger it. There's one more thing ancient humans reliably did with unstructured time, and it might matter more than the beads, the flute, and the daydreaming combined. They talked to each other about people who weren't in the room. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar, the same researcher behind the well-known finding that human social groups naturally cap out around 150 stable relationships, spent years studying what people actually talk about when the conversation has no obvious practical purpose. His research found that somewhere around 2/3 of ordinary human conversation is what most people would casually call gossip. Who did what, who said what happened to someone both people happen to know. That looks, on the surface, like wasted breath. Dunbar's argument is that it's the opposite. He proposes that human language itself evolved less as a tool for coordinating hunts and more as a replacement for physical grooming, the one-on-one bonding behavior other primates rely on to maintain their social relationships. Grooming has a hard limit. You can only groom one individual at a time, so your entire social world is capped by how many hours you can physically spend touching other animals. Language broke that constraint completely. Suddenly, you could maintain a bond with 3 people, 10 people, an entire group gathered around a single fire all at once, without touching any of them, and you could build trust in someone you'd never even met, just by hearing a story about them from someone you already trusted. On this account, human-scale society doesn't trace back to hunting logistics. It traces back to people with nothing else to do, sitting around, talking about each other, which puts the whole picture in an unfamiliar light. Roughly 75,000 years ago, someone bored in a cave in South Africa made a bead. Roughly 40,000 years ago, someone bored in a different cave in Germany made a flute. Somewhere across that enormous stretch of time, people sitting by fires with nothing scheduled started asking questions nobody had answers to yet about death, about the sky, about why anything is the way it is, and some of those idle questions eventually hardened into religion, some into philosophy, some into what we'd now call science. And some of them, if you trace the line all the way forward, became you lying awake at some point with your phone on your chest, thinking about nothing in particular, because your mind finally has a spare moment and doesn't quite know what to do with it. Here's the part modern research keeps circling back to, and it complicates the picture of boredom as purely a nuisance to be eliminated. Neuroscientists have identified something called the default mode network, a set of connected brain regions, first clearly described in the early 2000s. That activates specifically when you're not focused on any external task. It's the network responsible for a lot of the cognitive work most people quietly assume just happens automatically. Self-reflection, memory consolidation, imagining future scenarios, empathizing with other people's inner lives, and repeatedly across a growing body of research creative insight. And it tends to switch on precisely when external stimulation drops away, not during focused, demanding tasks. During the boring stretches, for most of the roughly 300,000 years our species has existed, unstructured, unstimulated time simply wasn't scarce. It was the default background condition of being alive. Somewhere in the last couple of decades, that flipped. Hard and fast, a pocket-sized device now sits within arm's reach of most people on Earth at almost every waking moment, engineered specifically to make sure the default mode network never gets much of a chance to switch on uninterrupted. Which raises a genuinely uncomfortable question worth sitting with, rather than rushing past. If the specific mental state we've spent the last 20 years engineering out of daily life is the same state responsible for the bead, the flute, and every unanswered question that eventually became religion or science, what exactly are we trading away every time we reach for the phone instead of just letting the silence sit there a little longer? Boredom didn't hold ancient humans back from becoming who they were. On the evidence, it's a large part of what made them human in the first place. And every time you actually let a quiet, unfilled moment run its course, instead of immediately reaching for something to fill it, you're doing something with a much older, stranger lineage than it probably feels like the same basic thing that several tens of thousands of years ago quietly produced a bead, a flute, and a very long list of unanswered questions that are, in one form or another, still being asked. If you gave up your phone for one full day, do you think you'd get bored enough to make something, or just bored enough to stare at the wall? Let me know what you think in the comments. See you in the next one.